All right, guys, welcome to another episode. Today, I'm going to be talking about a very important topic that is very, very relevant to this time of the year. I'm not sure when you're going to listen to this episode, so it might be at a time of the year that it is not applicable to you. But as of right now, it's April 19th, and the weather, especially here in the South, is starting to change very rapidly. We're in Texas, so the Texas weather, sometimes it's a little bit cool, and we have days that it's already getting in the 80s. And it's just looking to get hotter and hotter. The hottest parts of the year here in Texas, at least, and I'm sure it's the same for some of the other states down here in the South. I know Louisiana is the same. I lived in Louisiana for some time, so I know it gets pretty hot down there too. I know Arizona gets very hot, Florida, all the southern states. This is also the case up north too, just not as much. There's a smaller window there. But the hottest parts of the year here in the South are going to be July and August. June's pretty hot. I mean, May's going to get pretty hot too. June's going to be pretty hot. July and August here in Texas, as I'm sure is the same in the other southern states, July and August gets very, very hot, especially when humidity is part of the equation here in some of the areas down here in the South. And with this comes the concern of your dog's safety and your dog's well-being. This is a topic that people are very concerned about, and some people are not concerned enough about it because we don't think about it as much. And if you've owned dogs for a very long period of time and you've lived in the South for a decent period of time, this is probably not something you're too concerned about. You already have some experience. But if you recently moved to the South, or if you recently acquired a dog, or if your dog situation has recently changed, you're going to have to be aware of some things. Maybe this isn't for you, but maybe this episode would be good for somebody you know who could listen to this. So share with people that you feel this would be useful for. So let's get right onto the topic. Obviously, the biggest concern with the hot climate is the dogs having some sort of heat injury. We don't want the dogs to pass out. We don't want them to die. This is also a concern in the very, very, very cold months of the year. But as of this moment, we are looking at the hottest parts of the year, especially in certain parts of the states. Now, the concern is especially relevant with working dogs. Okay, your average pet dog probably stays inside the house about 90% of the day. Your average pet dog, I'm not going to talk about whether that's right or wrong. That's a different topic. But your average pet dog probably spends a good 90% of the time inside the house, where it's climate controlled. So you turn your AC on when it's hot, you turn your heater on when it's cold, and the dog gets to experience that artificial, so to speak, environment where even if it's 100 degrees outside, you can keep it at 65 degrees, right? 72, however, whatever the temperature of your choice is when it's really hot outside. But that's the temperature that your dog also gets to experience. For your average pet dog, that's not a problem. The problem becomes increasingly concerning with either your working dogs or your pet dog that spends a decent amount of time outside. Now, some dogs do spend a very long period of time outside, even if they're not working dogs, even if they're just pets. Some people keep their dogs as outside dogs. Okay, they're primarily outside dogs. Again, I'm not here to debate whether that's right or wrong. People in different areas, people with different beliefs about this feel a certain way. That's not what the episode is about. Okay, we can talk about that in a separate episode if you guys have interest in this topic. But you have some dogs that do spend a decent amount of time outside, whether they're working dogs or they're guard dogs or they're pet dogs that just spend a decent amount of time outside. The problem can be very concerning when the temperature jumps pretty high, and on top of that, you have a lot of humidity. It can get very suffocating. And I know in Texas, and especially in those 2 months of the year that I mentioned, July and August, I know the temperature can get so hot, very quickly. It can get so hot that it's almost suffocating, where you feel the heat. Even in the shade, you feel the heat. So, like I said earlier, too, some people either don't think about it and they just wing it, and the dogs survive, they make it through, and the owner is oblivious to the fact that this dog has spent several hours very, very hot outside. Or the owner is very aware of it and they're very, very concerned. So they shield their dog from the elements and they keep it inside, and they're very concerned about even taking it outside. Here's the thing. Your dog is a dog regardless of what part of the year it is. If your dog is sort of a work, even if it's not a working dog, okay, your pet dog needs to exercise. They need to walk. They need to be stimulated. Something. They need some sort of activity. They can't just stay inside your house for a long period of time. That will create problems and a lot of boredom. And I do have a video on this topic on my YouTube channel, but it's primarily on the cold. So this is now on the flip side of that, the hot parts of the year. So if I have a dog that does need to play, does need to work, does need to spend time outside, does need to work, go for walks, whatever, but I'm too concerned about the heat, this could be an area of conflict for me as the owner, because I'm thinking, well, crap, I want to exercise my dog, but I don't want my dog to pass out 5 minutes into the walk. What if I'm playing fetch and this dog it's just looking so hot? But what do? Do I bring it inside? At what point do I bring it inside? I don't know what to do. And so people either are oblivious to it and they just get lucky and their dogs survive the hottest parts of the year, or they're very concerned and they baby the dog throughout the hottest and the coldest parts of the year. So I'm going to put things into perspective for you. I spent 18 months in Afghanistan working with the contract working dogs. And I can tell you from experience, these dogs are working when it's very, very hot, ridiculously hot. Okay? I'm talking about the contract working dogs, the civilian dogs, the military working dogs. I didn't mess with that. But it works very, very much the same way. I mean, I did see them do some things that, in my opinion, I didn't agree with. And I'll mention those here in a little bit too. But our working dogs, our contract working dogs, they were working in very hot temperatures. We couldn't just say, well, guys, it's 90 degrees outside, so we're not going to work the dogs. They're going to have to take a break. We're not going to be like, oh, well, I know the ECP is packed with, this checkpoint is packed with like 50 plus vehicles, so we're only going to search about 20, and then we got to call it quits because our dogs got to take a break. No, our dogs, yeah, they did take breaks. We did take the precautions, but they still worked. And it wasn't like we were abusing them. Like these dogs were like, oh my God, I just can't do this anymore. They were working and they were happy. Like to them, this was just a game. And not to mention, we also exercised our dogs. Our dogs went for walks with their handlers. Not only that, but they would not only exercise, they would also work, but also they would go, sometimes they would walk from our compound, walk to the checkpoints. This was very common. We didn't have vehicles where we drove our dogs to checkpoints and then from the checkpoint back to the compound. A lot of our handlers would walk, and they would take that as an opportunity to exercise their dogs. And they would take some pretty long walks. I spent about a year in Bagram and about 6 months in Shindand, so the west part of Afghanistan. And some of these walks to go, even from exercises, because it wasn't just work and then back to the compound, we would do training exercises. We would do drills every day. We would train. On top of that, they would also work. So they were on a rotation of training, working. That's how it was. So even when we did our training sessions, we would find different areas, different compounds throughout the base. We'd set up the training scenarios because we didn't have this big indoor facility that was climate controlled and our dogs got to train there. We trained wherever we could train. We didn't have, remember, we are contractors. Okay, people sometimes say, "Oh, stupid contractors," but we were given just tents. We didn't have the nice facilities for our handlers. We were given like the leftovers, like the bee huts and the tents. And, we didn't have the nice resources that the military working dogs had. So we had to do whatever we could with what we had. And this meant that a lot of the stuff we did was out in the open. And our handlers and their dogs would walk from the compound to the training scenario. And then from the training scenario, after working, back to the compound. And they would also walk to their station and then back to the compound. So these dogs were working a lot. But of course, I say working, but to the dogs, that they're having a blast. They're like, man, I get to play every single day for hours. This is awesome. So the dogs are having a blast. We just call it work, but to the dogs, they're the right dogs, properly selected. To them, it's a blast. So how could we do that in very, hotter, like the hottest I've ever been was in Afghanistan. Okay, way hotter than Texas, way hotter than Louisiana. Super, super hot. I don't care if it's a dry heat. It is freaking ridiculously hot. Like even in the shade, it was like 115 degrees. I mean, one time I even remember looking at the temperature of the thermometer outside. It was like 120. How was that even possible? And 120 even plus. Okay, like even in the shade, it was suffocating. And yeah, I mean that would be like very hot, but we would still do our training sessions. Okay, maybe not as long when it was that hot, but we still did. And the dogs were like, "Yeah, man, this is awesome. Yeah, I'm getting pretty hot, but I'm still doing this. This is an awesome activity." So how could we do that? And then we have people here in the U.S. going, "Oh my God, it's 80 degrees. I don't want to take my dog outside." Because of one simple fact. Our dogs in Afghanistan get acclimated. It wasn't because they were of cut from a different cloth. Although, yes, that is part of it. But that had nothing to do with their heat tolerance. It was the fact that they were acclimated. They were acclimated. That's the thing. Our dogs in Afghanistan were acclimated. Your average dog here in the U.S. doesn't get acclimated. They spend like the bulk of the day inside in this beautiful climate-controlled environment. And then we take them outside for like 10 minutes and they're spent. Like they are just exhausted and hot. And we're like, oh my God, see, this is why I don't take my dog out. It's too hot to do anything. Yeah, it's too hot for you. Dogs are incredibly resilient. If you think about dogs throughout the world, okay, just look at it from a different perspective. Dogs throughout the world, stray dogs, village dogs in different parts of the world where the temperature is brutal. I mean, we saw it in Afghanistan. There were loose dogs in Afghanistan. They didn't even have like they their tents with AC. They were out in like their mud huts, and they were out just walking about throughout the day. And that always baffled me. I was like, oh my God, these dogs are just walking out in the middle of nowhere for miles. These are loose dogs, okay, stray dogs in Afghanistan. So how did these dogs do it? But then our Fidos over here were like, oh my God, he's been 10 minutes outside. We got to bring him inside because they get acclimated. It's just that they adapt. Okay, they absolutely adapt. So if we live in a sort of a culture where everything has to be soft, and our dogs get, they get spoiled, so to speak, and they're inside, they get their nice cool water, and they get their ice cubes, and they get their cooling vests and their cooling beds. I've got nothing against those things, by the way. Okay, get the cooling vest, get the cooling bed. I'm okay with that. I don't have any problems with it. But don't expect your dog to be acclimated to handle the outside. This means that during the hottest times of the year, your dog is going to be bored. Or you could acclimate your dog. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that. But you have to remember, dogs are very resilient, but you can't just throw them in that environment and go, well, crap, dogs in Afghanistan, they're working and their stray dogs are walking around for hours when it's like 120. So tomorrow that changes for Fido. I'm going to leave him outside. No, your dog will freaking have a stroke. Your dog will just pass out. If they're not acclimated and you just suddenly go cold turkey, they're not going to do well. This has to be a process. So I want to tell you some of the tips that helped our dogs, and some of the safety tips as well to keep them safe, because heat exhaustion, heat injuries, that's a real threat. That's one thing that we were always keeping an eye out for. So we did have some things to keep an eye out for that told us, okay, we need to be careful here. Okay. But during those 18 months that I was there, we never had a dog had any heat injuries, not once. And I saw a lot of dogs. Not once did we have any dog have a heat injury. So here's how you acclimate the dog. Okay, let's say you have your dog and it's starting to get kind of warm. Here's what I do with my dog. I can tell you some things that I do with my dog, Rust. Okay, this is especially important if you have a working dog. So if you're kind of new to the whole working dog thing and you just got a working dog and now you want to get more active with that dog, whether it's a lab, and by the way, retriever trainers are really good at this. Some of the best people to acclimate dogs to the environment are retriever trainers, hands down. They're really good at this. The protection sport dog people, they usually spoil their dogs a little bit more. So here's what I do with Rust. Okay, Rust is a mouth breather. he is he gets excited for a second and like he's already like going. He's breathing through his mouth, which makes him tired even faster. So he gets pumped very, very quickly, and this already puts a lot of energy in his body. He's already putting out a lot of energy. So he gets hot very, very fast. This translates into shorter training sessions by default, because then he runs out of gas. He wants to keep going, but he's out of gas. So it's just not convenient for us, not convenient for him, not convenient for the progress of the sport for him. So I acclimate him. So what I do is when it starts to get hot, what I will do, one of the things I'll do is I'll start to have him spend time outside for like a few hours at a time. Maybe not when it's the hottest part of the day, but maybe when it's starting to warm up, I'll leave him crated outside. Okay? I'll leave him crated outside. This is obviously in an area that I trust. I mean, if I just lived in a busy street, on a busy street, I wouldn't leave him crated outside unattended, at least. Okay, so you have to see what's what's applicable to you, to your environment. But I will leave him crated outside for like a few hours here and there. And I know he's starting to get warm, and I'll let him get warm. I'm not cooking him and baking him in like the hottest part of the day. But as it starts to get warm, I start to now introduce some of that warmth into his part of his daily routine, a little bit at a time, safely. Then I'll bring him back inside. And then gradually I'll keep doing that. And as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, I'll keep leaving him outside for like a few hours at a time. Sometimes like 6 hours. Of course, he's taking potty breaks. He's still training. He's still coming out. But he's spending now a part of the day, even though it's a short part of the day, but a part of the day he's starting to spend it outside. Now, if it's ridiculously hot, like incredibly hot, no, I'm going to take safety precautions there. But the reason I do this is that so that when it gets really hot and we're working, it doesn't shock him. He's not like, oh my God, I'm hot. Now, to him, he's the type of dog that he wouldn't care. And working dogs are like that. Your average pet dog, they'll tell you, dude, I'm tired. And they'll just lay down and they'll stop chasing the ball. Working dogs, depending on how intense they are, the really nice ones will keep working until you have to stop them or they'll die. So with those dogs, you have to definitely make sure that you take the proper precautions and that you acclimate your dog if you want to keep them working, which I'm sure you do. Now, if it's too hot even for you to go outside, that's a different problem. You maybe need to acclimate yourself for the sake of your dog. But again, that's a different episode. Okay, I'm talking about the dog, for the sake of the dog. We want to acclimate him a little bit at a time. That's what we did in Afghanistan too. We didn't have like these, like the military working dog handlers. They had like awesome, and in Bagram at least, they had like this whole building, all just with all climate control, and all the dogs stayed in the building. In this nice, cool building with their handlers. And they would come out for training, but then they would go back inside. And like a couple of 100 yards down the road, where the contract working dog handlers were, we didn't have that nice steel building. We had the wooden bee huts with the AC that didn't always work. And in Kandahar, we even had the tents when it was so hot and dry. And if you've been in Kandahar, in tent city, even with the AC, you don't even feel the AC. It just feels like it's just blowing hot air. And our dogs would stay in there with us. So they'd be in their crate in this hot tent or bee hut. Now, obviously, it's a little bit cooler than being outside directly under the sun. But being inside the bee huts, being inside the tents, it wasn't that much cooler. So we got acclimated, the dogs got acclimated, and so it made the tolerance for heat much, much easier for our dogs. Also, the either they stayed in the kennels or in the crates with us inside, or we had these little kennel setups outside where, yes, they had a little area for them to cool off, but again, like they're spending a decent amount of time outside. A lot of it they're spending outside. So the other thing too that we did with our working dogs in Afghanistan that you want to be mindful of here as well, if you have a dog with a long coat, so big fur, furry dogs, one thing that people always want to do, and some of the military working dog handlers did, is they would shave their dogs. You don't really want to do that. It seems like it's a good idea. It makes sense. Like you're shaving their coat, so it seems like you're taking the coat off. But the thing is that big fur, the long coat, also acts as insulation. They can actually get hotter if you take their coat off. Okay? They can get hotter. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but trust me, they can actually get hotter if you shave them. I'm talking when it's really hot. And yes, if it's like 80, 75, 85, maybe if you shave it, that won't make too much of a difference. I'm talking like 90 to 100, 110 degrees. Okay? You don't want to do that. Another thing that people do, they tend to want to do when it's really hot, and some of the handlers would do this too. They would pour water on they would just spray them and just get them all wet. I know that sounds like a good idea, but it's not a good idea. Remember, I'm not talking about 70, 80 degree weather here. I'm talking about like 90, 100, 105, 110 degrees when it's really hot. You don't want to get your dog all wet, because what happens, remember the fur, the coat, okay? So what happens is that water gets trapped in their coat. And now as it starts to get hot, that water that is trapped in their coat now starts to also heat up. And even so, if you think, well, see, this is why we shave them. Even if you shave them, the same thing happens. That water that's on their body starts to heat up, because remember, I'm not talking about 75 degree weather. I'm talking about extreme heat. Okay, which if you live in Rhode Island or Connecticut, you probably don't have to worry about that too much. I know it doesn't get too hot, not compared to the South. And if it does, it doesn't typically last that long. But in the South, this is where you have to deal with the hot part of the year for a little bit longer. So remember, gradual, don't shave them. And don't spray them with water. That seems like a good idea, but don't spray them with water. If you're going to cool them off, this is one tip that we were taught, and it worked great. If your dog is really hot and you're like, man, this dog is so hot. It's really hot outside. We're going for a hike. What do I do? He's like, running out of gas. You can get your water bottle, okay, or whatever source of water you have, and get them wet, but not all over their body, but on the belly. Okay, get them wet on the belly, like under the armpits, underneath the flanks. So basically the lower part of the body, the belly, the chest, the armpits, the pads. But you don't want to do it on top, because again, that will just heat up. Okay, if it's on the belly, they don't have a whole lot of fur down there. Armpits, they don't have a whole lot of fur down there, and so it just works much better to cool them off. All right, so if you're going to get them wet, do that. Ice cubes, they're a great treat, but you don't want to rely on ice cubes. They're a great treat when it's hot. It's awesome. They love it. But another thing that we were warned against was, hey, I know it seems like a good idea to give them ice cubes and ice treats when it's like 100 and 100 plus degrees outside. But if you start giving them ice cubes and ice treats, it kind of resets their we were told this by the vets over there. Okay, I'm not making this up, and I might not remember the proper terminology that they used, but basically if it's really hot and they start eating ice cubes, even though it feels great at the time, what happens is now their bodies have to adapt, their core has to adapt again to the heat. So for 75, 80 degree weather, you're probably good. It's awesome treat. I'm talking 90, 100, 100 plus. You want to take it easy on the ice treats. Okay. Now, the other thing is the pads. There's just another part of the adaptation process. I mean, my wife has walked our dog before, and people are like, "Oh my God, like this dog is walking outside," and it was only like 90 degrees. Which is hot, but like it's only like 90, like 80 some degrees. 90 is hot for people here in the U.S., right? Or people in general. Oh my God, 90, that's crazy. No, like until you've experienced 115, you don't know what hot is. But anyway, so like my wife has walked our dog like when it was like in the high 80s, maybe 90s, and dog's getting acclimated, dog's adapting pretty well, and people will be like looking at her with the evil eye, telling her, "Oh my God, that dog should be inside. You're gonna burn its pads." And you see this in the Facebook posts too. I've seen this in the Facebook posts, and it's just so dumb when I see that. I'm like, oh, people are like, "Oh, keep an eye on your dog's pads. Now that it's getting hot, they're gonna burn." They show you the picture of like pads that have been torn the hell off, right? And yes, it can happen with a spoiled dog, a dog that doesn't spend any time outside, doesn't get acclimated. It can happen. I'm going to default back to my example when I was in Afghanistan. Our dogs didn't have booties. And that's the thing. Like the military working dog handlers, their dogs were like geared up. They had the booties. So the dogs would wear the booties to, they were like high speed. We, the contractors, we just got whatever leftovers we could get. And we didn't have booties. So our dogs were like, their pads were making direct contact with the ground with the hot gravel. Because it's not just sand. There's also some pavement there. And instead of sidewalks, at least when I was there, this is back in 2010, 2011, something like that. So at least when I was there, it was like a lot of gravel. If you think a sidewalk gets hot, a smooth sidewalk gets hot like at 90 degrees, touch hot gravel, again, when it's like over 100 degrees. The gravel is so hot, and not only that, but it's also sharp. So imagine walking barefoot on hot gravel. That would be very uncomfortable. Yet our dogs managed to do it because they were acclimated. Not only were they acclimated to the heat, but their pads were also adapted to the rough terrain and the hot environment. This is something the dog in most urban areas doesn't ever experience. They got their lawn and they're like great, and so when they go for a walk, the dogs are freaking out because they're like, oh my god, it's so hot, and people go, oh my god, my poor dog, it's 85 degrees outside, this is torture. No, the dogs can acclimate. Their pads can thicken up, and I've seen it. I've seen their pads get so thick and they adapt so well to the hot gravel. So they can. Dogs are incredibly versatile. Okay, they really are. They're not these little helpless babies that we paint them as. They're incredibly adaptable. Think about all the stray dogs all over the world. The climate doesn't change for them. It just goes on and they adapt. So their pads can also adapt to hot surfaces. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about some of the safety things that you have to keep an eye out for. Okay. If you are out and you're taking your time, like you should be, okay, you're taking your time, your dog is doing pretty well, they're adapting to the heat nice and smoothly, and they're doing great, you're doing great, you're diligent, and your dog's actually doing pretty decent in the hot weather. That's good and all, but always keep an eye on your dog. Okay, just because they're adapted and they can adapt to the heat and the hot surface, it doesn't mean that they're immune to heat injuries. That can still happen. That was one of our major concerns with the working dogs in Afghanistan. That was one of the major concerns was heat injuries. We even had the periodic class where the military working dogs, so the veterinarians would come to our compound and talk to us about this because it's a big concern. Now, of course, our dogs are very acclimated. In my opinion, okay, this is just my opinion from what I saw. In my opinion, the contract working dogs were much more acclimated than the military working dogs. Like I said, the military working dogs, they had the nice facility, the nice setup, the nice gear. We just had like very little, so we had to do the best we could with what we had, and our dogs ended up being very well adapted to the environment. But even though they did well, we kept an eye on them. So like if we notice the dogs, like if you notice your dog's tongue is extra long and it starts to look like a spoon, and like their mouth is wide open, and you see their chest, like they're breathing so heavy and so rapidly that instead of breathing, it almost looks like they're shaking, you got to give your dog a break. Think about the working dog, okay? Especially if you have a working dog. If you're new to working dogs, you have to keep an eye on your dogs because they will not quit. They will go until their heart stops. That is That's not an exaggeration. I'm not saying, oh, look, they're hard work. No, like some of these dogs will truly go until their heart stops. So when you start to see that, like the chest, they're breathing so heavy that they're almost shaking. Their tongues are way out, looking like a spoon. Their mouths are wide open. You have to make sure that you give your dog a break. Maybe they're not fully acclimated yet. Or maybe even being acclimated, they're still running out of gas. It's still taking a toll on their body. So you have to keep an eye on that. Okay. Watch for the breathing. Watch for the tongue. All of that stuff. Also, I know the pavement can get very, very hot to the point that it starts to melt a little bit. I've seen it when it gets so hot. You can see the heat radiating off the ground. You can actually see the heat radiating off the ground in some instances when it's really hot. In those instances, you might have noticed it too. You might have experienced it even when you're walking on the pavement, like on the road. You'll notice that sometimes the road gets a little bit sticky because it's so hot that it's slightly melting the surface just a little bit. You got to keep an eye on that too. Just because our dogs get acclimated, they can acclimate and they can adapt, doesn't mean that we have to be constantly proving that they're well adapted. Okay, so just remember to acclimate your dog, do it gradually, a few hours at a time. Don't shy away from the heat. Okay, your dog still needs to exercise. They still need to work even when it's really hot. You just have to make sure that they're acclimated. If they are not acclimated, if they're just inside all day long, don't expect them to work great. Don't expect them to be out there for a while. The problem with when they're not acclimated and you can only take them out for like 5 minutes at a time, they don't get to be fulfilled. Now you're talking about asking them for like 2 months to be like, just be an inside dog. And they need exercise. So that can be very, very challenging for them. So give them the opportunity to still play with them and take them out even when it's really hot. So gradual, use a crate to kind of have them gradually spend a few hours at a time outside. Make sure it's supervised. Make sure that they are good with the crate. They're not busting out of the crate. And that you're kind of keeping an eye on them. So what I do with Rust is I'll leave him in the back of the car in the crate. So there is some shade because the hatch door does provide some shade, but he's experiencing the heat, okay? And he's good in the crate. He chills in the crate. He's not like one of those dogs that is constantly kicking the crate and trying to get out of the crate. So he's pretty chill. If he was that type of dog, I would definitely get a different crate, a much more secure crate. But it's in a place, in an environment where it's very predictable. It's either at work or in my house where I don't get any traffic in my street. So it works out pretty well. Plus, I have a gate, huge driveway or front yard with a long driveway. So the odds of somebody casually walking into my front lawn, into my driveway are very, very unlikely. So make sure you work on that. And remember, if you're going to cool them off with water when it's really hot, try not to do it all over their body, but underneath the body, so the belly, the armpits, the flanks. And keep an eye out for the ice cubes. Okay, the ice treats are great, but it starts to push like 100, like 90 something degrees, and you want to just cool them off real quick. It'll be good temporary, but now their core is going to have to kind of adapt all over again. That can be stressful. So I just wanted to leave that with you. And just remember, they can still work in the hot parts of the month, parts of the year. So I'll leave you guys with that. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, at Dog Training is My Passion. Check out my books on Amazon. Just search William Garrido, Garrido. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Take care. If you have any questions, please let me know.